Hi everyone, here are just a few thoughts on Chapter 4. In particular, I want to talk about IRB and validity. So IRB is a question that I get occasionally from students in class, and they want to know if we need to go through IRB for evaluation projects. So if you're not familiar with it, IRB stands for Institutional Review Board. It's what in the olden days we used to call Human Subjects Review. And when you're doing research, you need to send your proposal, what you intend to do, to the IRB, and the IRB reviews it to make sure that no person is going to be harmed by the way that you are collecting your data in this research project. IRB only applies to research projects. It does not apply to evaluation projects. And sometimes people think every time they're gathering data, they need to go through IRB, but that's not true. You do not need to go through IRB for an evaluation project. So I am going to serve as your check instead of the IRB. So because for many of you, this is the first time you're going through a structured evaluation project, before you can collect data, I am going to look at the way that you're planning to collect data. I'm going to look at the instruments, the questions, the surveys, anything that you're using in order to collect your data. And I'm going to give you feedback on that before you collect your data. So that's actually the break between Part 3 and Part 4 of your assignment. So by Part 3 of your assignment, you will submit all the instruments, all the questions, all the protocol that you're going to be using to gather your data, and you're not going to be allowed to gather data until I give you the thumbs up on it. Now, I've mentioned this several times already in class, but you are welcome to ask me questions, to get my feedback, to have me work along with you as you are working on any part of your evaluation project, including putting together your instruments. All right, that's IRB. Now, I also wanted to talk about validity and reliability. In your reading for this week, the authors talk about validity and reliability. So generally speaking, when we talk about validity and reliability, validity means, does the thing measure what it's supposed to measure? So whether it's an evaluation design, whether it's a survey, whether it's a test, whether it's something else, does it measure what it's supposed to measure? That means, is it valid or is it not valid? Reliability, on the other hand, refers to the repeatability of the findings. So for example, if we think of a thermometer, in terms of validity, a thermometer measures temperature. So it measures what it's supposed to measure. But a thermometer does not measure weight, it doesn't measure intelligence, it doesn't measure length, it doesn't measure height, it measures temperature. So it's the same thing when you're putting together a test or a quiz or an instrument, or as we'll talk about in a minute, an evaluation design. We want to make sure that it measures what it's supposed to measure. If it's a thermometer, it's supposed to measure temperature. If you're looking to see if someone is able to effectively coach, then it needs to measure people's ability to effectively coach. So validity means it measures what it's supposed to measure. On the other hand, reliability, as I said, is the repeatability of the findings. So in terms of our thermometer, what reliability means is that every time we put that thermometer in a 50-degree pot of water, it says 50 degrees. And every time we put it in an 80-degree pot of water, it says 80 degrees. So it's the repeatability, if we measure it over and over and over, we will get the same result over and over and over if that result has not changed. That's what reliability means. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about validity and reliability when we start talking about putting together your instruments, but for now we're going to be talking about validity and evaluation design, because that's what was covered in this chapter. So the first thing the authors cover in this chapter is internal validity. And internal validity is the extent to which the evaluation or the needs assessment answers the question that it says it's going to answer about what's being evaluated. So in your evaluation, you are going to say the purpose of this evaluation is to XYZ. Internal validity means that you are in fact measuring and answering that question that you say that you're going to answer. Now, in the chapter that you read, the authors talk about several threats to internal validity. So one threat is inaccurate assumptions about what's being evaluated. Now, these are the assumptions of the client, of the stakeholders, but they're also your assumptions that you bring to the evaluation. So an important part of setting up your evaluation design is making sure that you have a way to banish the assumptions that you all have about what is being evaluated. There are several ways to do that, many of which are mentioned in your book, but we can talk more about that as you work on creating the design for your own evaluation. The second threat to internal validity is what's referred to as a confounding variable. And a confounding variable just means something else that's going on that you're not taking into consideration. So let's say, for example, I was doing an evaluation after a class on coaching training, and I wanted to see if the people were able, in fact, to do effective coaching. Now, a confounding variable might be that not only did they go to my coaching class, but they also went to another coaching class. Or a confounding variable might be, even though they went to my else, that's influencing the result that you're trying to measure. And the third bullet point here is that your data collection measures don't accurately measure the underlying concern. So if what you say, for example, is that you want to evaluate and measure whether people can actually do effective coaching, but you give them a multiple choice test on knowledge about coaching, that's not measuring if they can coach. That's only measuring if they know about coaching. And I throw that one out there because I think that's a fairly common common threat that we see to internal validity, is that we want to actually measure if someone can do, but we measure instead what they know about doing. And knowing and doing are not the same thing. And then finally, the fourth threat to internal validity that was mentioned in your book is non-equivalence between two or more groups that are being measured in the evaluation. So let's say, for example, I used a design where one group I measured their ability to be effective coaches, and another group I sent through a coaching class and then measured their ability to be effective coaches. So what was different is that one group went through a coaching class. But if the groups were made up, one of all brand new coaches and the other of experienced managers and coaches, then those groups are not equivalent. So it's not the fact that one group went through training that makes them non-equivalent, because that's, as you read this week, an example of an evaluation design. But it's the fact that the makeups of the group are not equivalent. So they have very different levels of experience, or they have very different, some other factor that matters to whatever you're measuring. So those are all threats to internal validity. Now, part of the challenge is there's a cost to making sure that you have internal validity. It might take, if we look at the first threat to internal validity about inaccurate assumptions, it takes a lot of time in order to clear up those assumptions. If you look at confounding variables, it takes a lot more work to eliminate confounding variables because you need to measure more things, you need to get more people involved, et cetera, et cetera. So part of what you need to do is you need to sort of balance off the importance of internal validity versus the cost of assuring that internal validity. Now, in a perfect world, we'd do whatever it takes to get internal validity. Because again, internal validity means that we're answering the question that we say that we're going to answer in terms of this evaluation. So internal validity matters to us, but out in the real world, we don't always have the time, the money, the bandwidth in order to actually assure the internal validity. So this is something that each of us as evaluators need to come to grips with in our own evaluation. And if you are not addressing threats to internal validity, you need to be able to explain why you are not doing that. Otherwise, if your evaluation does not have sufficient internal validity, then it's of no use because you're not answering the question that you claim you're going to answer. So that's internal validity. But the authors also talked about several other kinds of validity that I want to briefly cover. One is external validity. And external validity is the extent to which the results can be generalized to other situations. So this is something we see a lot in research. So in research, we care deeply about validity, particularly the validity of the instruments we use to gather data, because in research, we are typically saying, here's something that's true for this small group, and we're going to say that it's probably true for a large group that we didn't gather data from. We don't usually do that kind of generalization in evaluation. In evaluation, we tend to say, I'm looking at this organization at this point in time right now, what do I find out? We're not trying to generalize to other organizations or even to this organization in another point in time. So external validity matters, but it doesn't matter as much in evaluation as internal validity does. All right, a couple other kinds of validity. The authors mentioned multicultural validity, and multicultural validity is the extent to which there is accuracy across dimensions of cultural diversity. And so they mentioned demographics, which include things like race and ethnicity and gender and age and religion and sexual orientation and language. They talked about sociopolitical factors, which is power and economic status and class differences, and then any other kind of context-based factors that might be true in the organization in which you are doing your evaluation. And then finally, they mentioned validity and qualitative data. Now, when we move further in the course and start talking about quantitative data and qualitative data, we will raise this idea of validity again with both quant and qual data. But your chapter talks specifically about validity and qualitative data. So those are the things I just wanted to highlight from your reading for this week. If you have questions on any of this, be sure to let me know.